Every CISO thinks they know their biggest risks until they see it. Rehman's CISO MindMap highlights the modern complexity of building a security program. It is a brutal reality check. If you're missing even one of these areas, you're not just vulnerable, you're already compromised. In this episode, we're breaking down the challenges this level of complexity brings, and we'll talk to some of the overlooked threats and the strategic moves that separate elite CISOs from the rest. Let's get into it.
So Aftab, it's great to see you. With the premise of what we're talking about here, CISO and security teams are just stretched amazingly thin. They've got to help so many different parts of the organization. They get called into, whatever incident du jour is coming in, and I know that that's one primary specific point of Rafeeq's mind map. But if you were to really think about, pulling this out, putting it into the various pieces that it is, and saying this is an area of priority that is going to get the biggest impact for the organization and for the CISO directly, what would you say that is?
If I had to pull out in one area, I think the operational piece is very important. Blocking and tackling portion of it. I think that as much as we may not like to admit it, it's just the reality that, at the end of the day, right? Like when you talk about incident response, when you talk about technical controls and things like that, having folks who are well-versed and understand and how to implement that. Right. And we always, and I think we talked about this in a few episodes ago, but being able to have these teams really, really partner well with the X-functional teams. So I think the operational portion of it would be something that if I had to, it's difficult. If I had to pick one, and then obviously the compliance stuff would be a close second. But the technical, the operational stuff, the blocking and tackling is very important.
Yeah, no, I find that interesting. From an operational perspective, it seems like that altogether is unavoidable. Most of the time you're stepping into it, or even if you're building from the ground up right away, you've still got some level of operations that's going to hit your primary domains. When it gets into, it's interesting that you say the compliance side of it as well. I know that the compliance side in a lot of different organizations, you start to see this starting to shift between your general counsel legal function, where security is some support of it, because it's so much bigger than just security, right? Security is going to have some piece in that, but so is operations and the product owners and all the different verticals that are out there. It's very interesting, as you start to see how, compliance fits into the major scenarios there. But I always look at, from, if operations are going to continue, and I want to get to a scenario where it's going to be effective. And we've covered this, quite a bit in the back end too, but it's really a function of how do we tie into, the business itself, right? And the enablement side of what the business is attempting to do, whether it's the mergers and acquisitions, whether it is, changing scope and type of business, whether it is, taking on new products or services, or we've got so many different things that'll come in to the fold, but it really comes down to how is the organization making money, or how can they make money without introducing a lot of risk. So it's operations, to me at the very least, it would seem like that would be secondary. It's obviously an area of focus, but, it's kind of like running on the treadmill, right? If you run on the treadmill and you're moving your legs and you get done, you're still in the same spot. We got to be in a scenario where we're really, really working into what are we driving toward, really?
Yeah. But, it's a tough question, because it's just, we talked about this, and the more and more that I've got an opportunity to kind of take on different portions of a program, just to complexity. And it's, you can maybe highlight one area or over-index in one portion of it. But I think, stepping back, look, we can pick and choose, but ultimately, like, how do you make all of them work in like a synergistic way, right? Like, so when you think about operations, okay, put that aside for a second. When you think about, maybe your company develops an application, and so, how does your AppSec team, but all of this ultimately fits together. And then how do you build harmony across all the other functions that need to support it, right? You talk about R&D, talk about legal, you talk about HR, internal comps, right? I mean, all of this and that, and like, put aside the domain, right? The harmony is probably the area that the CISO would be able to provide here themselves the most value, right? To be able to move the needle, keep folks in line and focus. So,
how do you bring that harmony?
yeah. It's like, so how do you bring that harmony? Well, number one is having the relationships. We talked about this, I think, in a few episodes ago around like being able to, having that high level IQ, EQ, and having these relationships. You could walk in any room with all the technical understanding, all the compliance requirements, but if you don't have the relationships and you don't have the folks understanding and having a belief system in like your program and what you're trying to accomplish, that harmony becomes that much more difficult. So yes, we have these different domains. Yes, we have these different areas that we have to focus on, and I think the complexity will get exponentially greater. I don't think that moving forward things will get easier. So it becomes more and more vital for the CISO to play that quarterback and making sure all these functions can work together, because So,
yeah, I think you call out the relationship. There's no way when looking at this mind map, the first time I saw it was just like, number one, who's going to jump into this type of profession thinking that they're going to accomplish any of these things, right? I mean, it's that are we 1 inch, deep and 10 miles wide, or, and this is where we start to get into the different layers of the organization, right? Where we can be 10 miles deep and 1 inch wide. But it's, for all intents and purposes, none of this is going to be accomplished without there being a scenario of support from the top and support across.
Yeah, one other thing, Scott, that I wanted to just highlight is, I think the MindMap's also a good way to just be realistic with not only with yourself, but also, your organization in terms of, doesn't matter how large your team is or just how committed the organization is to security. There's a reality that it's just so complex that there are some areas that you would have to deprioritize or won't get the TLC that's needed. So that was one of the big takeaways that I've always had from that map as well. So as we kind of talk a little bit about this, like, in your opinion, Scott, do you think there's an area on the mind map that in 5 years that won't be as relevant or maybe fundamentally different, or just not relevant at all?
I wouldn't say that not relevant. What I would suggest, though, is this, and this may be against popular opinion, but the whole function of artificial intelligence and generative AI. I honestly believe it's going to be more integrated in everything else that's on this mind map, as opposed to it being called out specifically, right? Because if we think about any of the activities and new inventions and technologies, and you've got the blockchains, and we've got upcoming quantum, computing and things like that we need to start to consider. This right now, it deserves a lot of focus and attention. Organizations need to determine what is their primary use cases, what are the benefits that they look to get out of it, how are they going to design it, what are they going to make sure from a risk basis that they're not, not ending up in a scenario where they're self-inflicted risk, right? Where you've got these chat bots that are all of a sudden interacting with your customers and, pushing PII out there. We've got to understand, that's a primary position of data. AI is a very, strong solution that's going to help productivity. It's going to help innovation. AI has been around for quite some time, just not as tangible, as far as, how people are using it and where is it being embedded in products today. But I don't know if that in 5 years stands alone by its own, position, or does it get integrated into almost every other single primary pillar within this mind map?
No, I agree with you in this sense, right? I think that AI, or whatever that means to folks, right? We talk about LLM, or we talk, have you had the agentic AI and stuff? The reality there is that it's going to augment everything that we do, right? And so I don't, just fundamentally remember, it's not only like 15 years ago when mobile was first introduced, and there was all of these conversations around. It's going to fundamentally shift the way we do things. I look back now, and the better word would be use augment. And I think that for AI, and particularly in security, it'll augment a lot. And for me, I think there are some areas that will be, I think the operational piece, the area that we highlighted just earlier, I'm seeing it in my organization now. Like the way we are fundamentally looking at problems is different, right? How we think about standard SOPs. How do we think about security threat modeling? How the team are doing like third-party assessments with the ability to leverage these models. We are now asking ourselves fundamentally different questions. Now, does that change that we're, IR, is it going to go away? No, but it will look vastly different. Certainly. And I think that's a portion where AI or whatever the technology will be moving forward will now require teams and CISOs to shift the way they view these problems. I'll give you one example, and I'm actually dealing with this right now. We have a third-party audit program, and a lot of it was done manually, and so we've implemented. We were looking to implement AI to do some summarization for us, right? Capture artifacts and have the models leverage the AI to do some summarization. The question we're asking now, particularly for like a tier one vendors, is let's, instead of this being a point and instance of time, how can we do this continuously? Mm-hmm. And this is a small use case for us, but you kind of step back and you think about audits in general. Right? How often do you recertify for ISO? It's once a year. Well, how is that going to change? Because today the necessity of how often can you do an audit is limited by the human factor, right? Mm-hmm. So how often can you have a human respond to these questionnaires? I think in the AI world, a very fundamentally different question we can ask is, can this be done all the time? Can we ensure that you, in fact, are meeting these criteria, not just, July 15th on the audit date, but July 21st, December 25th. And that, I think, will change. And I think some of the EU legislation that'll go into effect here at the end of the year, like NIS2, will require that. So I think AI will play a role in that. And I do think that I'm bullish on that. I think if there's any folks considering building a startup, I definitely think that this would be an area.
Is that a shameless plug there to contact AFTAP?
No, I just think I don't know if it's but I do believe it's an area that there could be a lot of disruption.
All right, so we're covering a little bit. We see I'm sure we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about AI and all the different places that it is going to benefit. It has benefited in a lot of cases, still doesn't even have the foundation yet to benefit. But aside from that, this one section that I think is very important for it to be in there today. But what is the most overlooked position across this entire mind map that you think is something that CISOs tend to miss?
Yeah, overlook. Wow. Which one of my kids do I like the most? Kind of question. I always highlight, and I think we talked about this, is that the human element. So, your people, your employees, the HR functions, the systems that are not, the areas that are not so glamorous, I do think get left behind. Insider risk, there's a lot of emphasis being placed, at least at the organization, in terms of insider risk. And I think that that's a place where it's not as, I want to use the word sexy, but I do find that it does get lost as kind of the, neglected stepchild, as you way. So that would be a portion that I would mention. But again, it's hard only because I can make an argument that identity still, even as important as it is, a lot of organizations that I've come across and have spoken, leaders that I've spoken to, don't realize it's how much time and effort actually should be spent on it. They think the RBAC and MFA is enough, and you start talking about non-human identities now. So, but yeah, the human element, the HR function, the pieces that relate to like offboarding and things like that. I think that's an area that does get left behind.
Yeah, that seems, that to some extent I agree with you, because there are some elements that are in there, that just aren't, attractive. They're controls, right? Like you said, insider risk, I think it's very important for organizations to focus on, but there's a lot of this, continual and historical focus that's always been on the perimeter, keeping the bad actors out, and at the end of the day, what, you're seeing more and more today is that, the attacks aren't happening by breaking in, they're happening by logging in. The biggest issue that I would see that is overlooked, and this is across the variety of spaces in different industries, and some of the folks that I've spoken to, is that team branding. If the CISO team is not in the security team itself, and we kind of covered this in last season as well.
We did, yeah.
If there is this idea that the security team has no name, they're just the security team, they're badge heavy, their culture of no, they're not enabling the business, we're really not tied to business to be able to identify how are we, reporting upwards and making sure that here's the wins, here's the risk that's been reduced, here are the things that we've identified and stopped from the operational side. Here's some, gains that we were able to make by taking on new acquisitions without there being any risk, these types of things where, a security team is now, well, we got to talk to FTAB, we got to talk to Scott, we got to talk to James, we've got to talk to these folks, right? I mean, these are very important pieces to build that overall culture. The onboarding, offboarding, and some of the sub controls that exist there, they seem, negligible when it comes down to how is security viewed in the organization. And that really starts from the top down, and the CISO has the biggest impact on how that's going to be viewed in the organization, because they've got access to the board, hopefully. They certainly have access to the C-suite, and they are setting the tone across the board all the way down, so that it's not a scenario of saying, all of these things, security, not everything in security is fun. Absolutely not. Not everything in any job or any vertical or discipline within the organization is fun. But what makes it different, and to some of what you were talking about, right? The human element. How do we personalize ourselves? How do we brand ourselves to being important in this organization to achieve the goal together, versus having this consistent butting of heads on, I want to do, but security's saying no, or security's getting in the way, or security's delaying, or something is always delaying. That is a position that having security integrated throughout the business, throughout processes, I find to be separating successful from not.
I do agree that branding is important, right? But I will acknowledge, and I think that the security organizations do place or realize that it's important. And I think the question was around like what gets neglected, right? And I think that if you don't, quote unquote, have a good brand within the organization, that has I think would have a smaller effect if you, by neglecting the HR, and I don't want to highlight HR, but these insider HR human pieces of it. And I think that's where that I see it a little differently. And the organizations that I've talked to or had the luxury of having some conversations with, like, I don't think there's enough emphasis or realization that, hey, should be a bigger part of your program. So looking at that map in its totality, yeah, I get it. The branding is important, but I think this portion of it gets left behind too often, and it's a large enough vector, a risk, that I think that leaving it behind or not spending as much time or resource on it is probably going to come back and affect your program in the long term. Whereas the branding piece of it, if you get it wrong, yeah, I'm sure you have a little more uphill to climb when partnering with teams, but I don't see the branding as being a high-level risk or something that can be exposed. So,
but we can argue about that later.
Yeah, but I mean, look, I love you. I love you, Scott, but we just see this one a little differently, man.
Of course,
Scott, let's go. Yeah, let's go to the next section.
Rafeeq Rehman's CISO MindMap lays out the complexity security leaders have to juggle, from zero trust to ransomware, insider threats, and supply chain security. But here's the problem: you can't do it all. Budgets are tight, executives push back, and CISOs are forced to make impossible trade-offs every single day. So today, we're putting Aftab in the hot seat. I'm going to pitch him 3 high-stakes security initiatives, all real, all expensive, and all guaranteed to make some people very, very unhappy. But he can only choose one as his top priority. Let's see what makes the cut and what gets left to burn. All right, here are the 3 security initiatives. Now remember, you can only choose one here. So I'm going to lay it out for you, these 3 specifically. Tell me which one that needs priority. And you're going to have to explain that answer too. You just can't say one. All right, so here we go. You can deploy a real-time threat intelligence platform that feeds data from global attack patterns into your defenses, allowing you to predict and block attacks before they happen. But this requires constant tuning and a team to interpret the data. All right, initiative 2. Most breaches happen because unpatched systems. You can deploy AI-powered automated patching system that applies security updates across all devices instantly, eliminating patch delays. But some legacy systems may break and rollout will be complex. That never happens, right? And then initiative 3. You can expand your SOC to 24/7 coverage, ensuring instant response to any threat. This drastically reduces breach impact, but requires major hiring, budget increases, and leadership support. Which one has the biggest business impact?
So piece of clarity. Yeah, the one piece of clarity, the SOC is already functioning. So the scenario 3 is expanding it to 24/7, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
That's right.
So if we have a functioning SOC already, I think I would prioritize initiative 2. I mean, there's some high level of statistics, data that shares that a high percentage of breaches come from just unpatched systems. So if we have a SOC in place already, the putting a program to just do the basic minimum of patching, and if we're talking about using AI system for that, I would be all in for it. If I had to stack rank them, 3 would come next, expanded to 24/7, and then threat intelligence, because it's a support function of the SOC, I would probably put that as my third. But definitely, if a SOC is already in place, number 2 would be my answer.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree. You know, the 24/7 SOC, it's obviously a very important thing, but that's something that could be offloaded. You know, even not necessarily offloaded, but I'll use a word that you used earlier, augmented, right? Because you do have more of your MDR solutions that are out there that are 24/7 that you don't necessarily need to focus on hiring. It does have budget increases, but to your point, you know, the unpatched systems. You know, it's funny just to think about. There was a breach, and I'm not going to name any company names. I'm sure our listeners will know, but where you know the ones that hit the major airlines, and there was something about a Windows 95 system that was still out there. It's like, is our attackers even focused on that anymore because it's so old? But you know, at the end of the day, a lot of these legacy systems exist in a lot of different ways because you know the fear of turning them off or rebooting them or patching them has major business impact. So that's a heck of a balance. I've seen it and I hear about it all the time. Well, I appreciate you playing this game with me. Of course, this is always extremely, extremely fun to get some intakes here with some of these prompts.
Want your podcast to feel like a full-on TV production? That's exactly what Sweetfish does. At their 4,000 square foot creator house, they bring co-hosts together in real life, run multi-camera shoots, and create B2B shows that look better than 99% of what's out there. If you want in, go to sweetfishmedia.com and book a call.
Some security programs are bulletproof, and some are held together with duct tape and wishful thinking. In this segment, we're putting each other to the test. We'll hand each other a disaster of a security program, full of blind spots, bad decisions, and ticking time bombs. Our job, fix it in 60 seconds or less. No pressure, right? Let's see how this goes. All right, Aftab, you ready? Here we go. The scenario exists that there's a company that thinks they're secure, right? Never heard this before. They've spent millions of dollars on tools, but their security program is a hot mess. Problems that they have, again, every security tool imaginable. They got the SIMs, the EDRs, the DLPs, the CASBs, the SOARs. They got everything that you could possibly name and all of that, the alphabet soup that's out there. But no one knows how to use them effectively. MFA is the only thing that they have from an enforcement mechanism for authentication, but it's only enforced for executives. Employees use passwords like company name 123 or whatever their first initial, last name, birthday, right? And they share credentials over Slack. We know that Excel's the new Post-it note as well. Incident response plan, they have one, but it's in a Google Doc and no one's read it in 2 years. Phishing training is an annual checkbox exercise, and half of the company fails at least every time. Their SOC team is overwhelmed with thousands of alerts per day. They just mute most of them. They deal with the ones that seem urgent. And third-party vendors, they just assume because they signed a contract saying that they're following best practices that they are, and so they don't do any audits or any monitoring. Fix this in 60 seconds.
Wow. Okay, first question. Well, dude, that's not easy. 60 seconds. Okay, so first, what's the risk appetite? I always talk about like everything that we do on my team is our goal is risk reduction. So what's the company's risk appetite? Is it clear to all the team members? Number one. Now, is that appetite aligned with the business, right? So it's one thing for the security team to have an opinion on what our risks are, but they also have to have a very good synergy between what the business needs as well. So number one is I would start there. Then next, doesn't sound to me that there's a very clear strategic risk reduction plan. Okay, so what's our risk appetite? Number one. Number two would be, okay, let's put together a risk reduction plan. What are the areas that we are going to focus on, right? You just highlighted MFA and only executives, right? Is that identity? The SOC is overwhelmed. Are we going to place an emphasis and where? And then next thing I would fix it was let's ensure that our policies and our governance mechanisms are in place, right? Do folks even know what good looks like? What is our North Star from a controls perspective? And then how are we validating this? And then the last thing that I would use to fix this, and like everything to me comes down to numbers, is like what metrics are we driving towards? Right? It's one thing to say, okay, we have a risk appetite, we have policies in place, we're doing some security work, but that has to have a tangible response to it. Meaning to say we have to have metrics that everyone's very clear on, that we're driving reduction to or increasing, right? Are we reducing false positives on the SOC? Are we having less amount of compliance gaps that we need to fulfill? So what are the metrics that that are important to us? And are we in fact driving or have behavior that's having an effect on those? So that would be my 60 seconds of how I would fix that nightmare of a situation. But I probably need more than 60 seconds. All right, Scott. Okay, now you put me on the hot seat, man. Let me kind of do the same for you.
Flip the script. So gotcha.
Yeah. Good luck, man. This one's probably I'm gonna make it more difficult for you. All right. So the problem is the IT team manages infrastructure security, and they don't talk with the security team at all. The DevOps teams controls cloud security, but they're not security folks, so their main thrust is speed and not protection. The CISO reports to the CFO, so the decisions are based on potentially budget and not necessarily aligned with risk. The marketing team has full access to customer data because they need it for some tooling or some analytics work. No one is responsible for access management. And there are multiple security tools, but each one is owned by a different team. So the challenge, Scott, how do you fix it?
Well, sounds like nobody owns security in this location, but it's a scenario that's unfortunately, I would say, pretty common. I've had a lot of conversations with security, professionals within my network, that fall under that same thing. Where does the CISO sit specifically? I still think that's something that we need to fix, to have it be aligned, across, and maybe reporting to the CFO or to the CEO rather, or the board, versus always the CFO, as this pointed out, budget based only versus risk based. But I think, first and foremost, security is everyone's responsibility. It needs to be, something that is built into the culture of the organization. Obviously this is going to be from a top down, middle out, bottom up, regardless of how the organic focus comes to play. You still need to have a lot of, people playing in that sandbox and understanding that this is important. When it comes down to a strategy position, the top-down approach, that, setting the clear policies, making sure that the teams, regardless of if it's, security siloed or DevOps siloed or IT siloed, regardless of what the case may be, we got to have controls that are going to, support those policies. And how are we going to measure them, right? We've got to have, some position of ownership at the top to be able to say, okay, we're seeing effective usage across what we have, what we're trying to achieve, what are the risks that we have, how are we reducing them. I think we've covered the whole idea of a risk register. That could still be owned by a primary head, but the ownership and the mitigation strategies around risk reduction or risk management specifically don't always need to be within a silo, right? That could be and should be spread out across the entire organization, business owners, department heads, what have you. And then, I think that to some extent, CFOs, budget over risk is potentially misleading, because I think that CFOs have a strong focus on risk, but maybe in a very different position. But I really do think that it kind of comes down to, how do we have essentially support at the top, regardless of where that's spread, who owns what, and really aligning to what are we trying to achieve and how are we going to drive to those outcomes.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about the CFO. My experience, and this is kind of maybe anecdotal, but I've talked to many CFOs, and their approach has been like, I'm no problem spending on security, but they're always variable is I don't know what I'm getting, right? Meaning to say they know they get security, but they don't know what the tangible effects of any initiative, any spend is going to be. And that's where I think that, I would chime in a little bit, is that you can get the support, but you have to have as a CISO or a leader or an organization, provide the direct correlation between spend and risk reduction. And that's where I think organizations struggle, is that if you're asking for something, you have to have a very clear way of measuring it, what someone's getting out of that. And I think that the trouble happens is when there's not a very clear line of spend X means outcome Y. And this is how we know or definitively can say that the dollar spent here will relate to this outcome. And I think that risk reduction and an appetite is important. But when you talk about how to articulate that to the CFO and changing it from a budget conversation to a risk conversation, my experience has been they're more than apt to go on that journey with you, but the lack of clarity between action X and outcome Y is where the delta happens. So that is important, and I think that in this scenario we should highlight that quite a bit, because I think the statement of CFOs not necessarily aligning with security, I find that a little troubling, because my reality or what I've seen is a little different.
Sure.
So that's the one thing I would just comment on. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was about to say the other thing too, right? A CFO goes through very distinct training, certifications, paths on, finance heavy decisions, right? I think they have a very unique and tough, role in life, just based on that decision on where does money have to get spent. And the reality of it is, generally outside of their primary, focus. So whether it's security, whether it's technology, whether it's an operation, things that are outside of the realm of that core competency, to your point, bringing in, context, is very likely important. Not to disparage CFOs, but I still do believe in security, sitting almost equal with versus under any other C-level. It still seems when you look at leadership teams and boards across the various organization pages on their websites for companies, CISOs are very rarely listed, and that's problematic. All right, Aftab, tell us about our next segment.
With all this talk about Rafeeq's CISO MindMap, security teams have a massive workload. Threat detection, access reviews, insider risk management, and more. The problem? Too much of it is still manual. Some tasks should be automated, but not all of them. In this segment, Scott and I will go back and forth deciding whether we automate a security task or keep it manual. Let's get into it. All right, Scott, you're up first. User access reviews. Automated or nah?
Automate. I honestly believe automate. In a lot of cases, think about practical least privilege. If I can eliminate the access that people haven't utilized, then that saves a lot of time for the access reviewers. If we need to have any manual intervention around context or any requests that have been, I lost my access, that is such a small volume in compared to being able to eliminate over abused access that hasn't been utilized, access that exists that, from the movers and levers process that can be cleaned up. That needs to be an automated function. Data and permissions are everywhere, growing at a massive rate to all the different data stores that are out there. Without automation, it's not going to work. All right, buddy, it's your turn.
All right, let's do it.
So, phishing email analysis, automate or not?
Automate. Just the volume of phishing attempts, and just how I think the enrichment process, there's just a lot of manual steps that this is a no-brainer. I absolutely automate. If you can get your fidelity rates high, leverage AI. There's a lot of tools that are available, open source stuff actually as well, that you can take advantage of to do a lot of the heavy lift and to come to some sort of conclusion. You can still have an analyst make the final verdict, but I absolutely automate. This one is a no-brainer. All right, Scott, back to you. Privileged account monitoring, automate or not?
Automate. At this rate, everything needs to be automated as much as possible. You can catch the deltas on the back end.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, now it's back to you, my friend. So patching and vulnerability remediation, automate or not?
Is there a middle line in here? Because I think the patching, I wouldn't necessarily automate all patching. There's too much operational uptime risks to that. But I think vulnerability, portions of your vulnerability program should absolutely be automated. All right, Scott, back to you. Insider threat detection, automate or not?
Needs to be automated at the end of the day. You've got to detect abnormal activity. The only way that that's going to happen is having user behavioral-based analytics that threat models can respond to, and the only way that that's going to occur is through automation.
Okay. Yeah.
And last one for you, my friend, incident triage and prioritization, automate or not?
Automate. Very simple, automate. There is a lot of pieces of it that are repeatable. There are a lot of portions of this that can be scripted. There's even some models now that we've tested that this can be automated. So 100% automate here.
So FFAB, it sounds like we're at this day and age that automate everything is very true. As I've been seeing across the board and trying to practice myself, talking to organizations out there, is without automation, there's just too many security risks. And as we talked about a mind map that's showing all of them, there's just too much to do manually, and automation is something that we need to lean on.
Are you going to RSA conference? Varonis will be, and they're sponsoring the Optiv after party on April 29th from 7 to 10 p.m. in August Hall. Head over to learn.varonis.com/RSAC-2025 to learn more. Again, that's learn.varonis.com/RSAC-2025.
In security, some leaders don't just protect data. They shape the entire industry. Rafeeq Rehman's CISO MindMap highlights the impossible job CISOs face. but so many security leaders stand out for the way they cast vision, innovate, and push security forward. In this segment, we're nominating a CISO or industry leader to be inducted into our CISO Hall of Fame. We'll each make our case for one nominee, and one of these days we'll make trophies or something. All right, here we go. All right, you're up first, Aftab. You've been on the hot seat here today. So who are you nominating to the CISO Hall of Fame and why?
Wow. Okay. Well, he's not a CISO, but I think he's just a fantastic dynamic leader. It would be my man, Ashwin Bilal. He's a CIO of Freshworks. And he's been a huge mentor for me, but I think the thing that's probably the most important is that his take on leadership, his take on how to galvanize and get your teams moving in all directions is just fantastic. So if I had to choose one person, it would be him. All right, what about you, Scott? Put you on the hot seat, but who's someone you want to celebrate?
You know, I'm gonna take a cop out here, but essentially any CISO out there in the last 12 months that has combated a major security breach, but has stopped their organization from having massive materiality of data loss, any fines, any impact to the citizens of the globe, my hat's off to you, because that is not a small task, and there's probably way too many to name.
You know that feeling when you're at dinner with some of the smartest people in your industry, and you realize you have no idea what they're talking about? Early in my career, I was invited to one of my first CISO-only dinners, and then conversation turned to negotiating compensation and whether CISOs are actually covered by their company's insurance. And let's just say I had some catching up to do. In the next episode, we're breaking it all down. Are you personally on the hook if something goes wrong? How much leverage do CISOs really have? And the real question, are you getting paid what you're worth? If you're a CISO, you can't afford to miss this one. Tap subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and keep your eye out.
And remember, security fuels innovation, complexity is the enemy, and collaboration is the way. Until next time.